Hello, everyone. Afternoon, and thanks very much for inviting me to speak today. It's good to be joining your conference. Hope you've had a really good morning. So we've got a chunk of time this afternoon to focus on positive behaviour, positive attitudes, positive outcomes. I'm just going to give a bit of background to that and how that fits into the education inspection framework in particular. But if I do a bit of introduction, if that's okay. So my name's Nick Whittaker. I'm an education HMI in Ofsted, and I'm Ofsted's specialist advisor for SEN and disability. Prior to being a HMI, I was a special school head teacher, and before that a specialist teacher, Senko in mainstream school and school senior leader. So you'll recognise that that's a thinly veiled attempt to establish myself as a credible person in this audience. Today I'm going to focus on the education inspection framework, and in particular on the behaviour and attitudes judgment area. I guess the importance of positive behaviour and positive attitudes is implicit in the EIF, and one of a number of things that I want to explore today is the link between those things and the outcomes that children and young people with a special need or disability achieve. And I guess in all of this, of just how important it is and how difficult it can be for children and young people who experience transfer and generalise what they have learned about positive behaviour into their lives outside of the places where they're doing their learning, because the reality for many is that that is the key to them being visible and fully included in the places where they're going to go on to do more learning or to work or to live their adult lives. So I'm sure that routine inspection under the EIF and across our different remits in Ofsted is suspended currently, and I think it would be remiss of me to kind of launch into my slides this afternoon without saying something about how we see the disruption caused by the coronavirus has affected the lives of children and young people with SEND up and down the country. And you may already have read the briefing that we published on the 10th of November about the learning from our interim visits to local areas, the 6 local areas that we visited earlier in the term in October. Many of you, I'm sure, will have heard Amanda Spielman, Her Majesty's Chief Inspector, talking specifically about the experience of children and young people with SEND during this time at the launch of her 4th annual report yesterday. And amongst lots of other things, she talked about being particularly concerned about this group of children and people, about what they've lost, about their access to education, about their access to additional support, about their access to additional health services, about their access to routine and the importance of routine and access to understand them well and can meet their needs. What you and your colleagues do in schools day in and day out. She spoke about what we've learned about families finding it increasingly hard. And that as well as being fearful about their child's health and well-being, that families have had to cope with the loss of some of those informal kinds of support that they rely on from family and friends. And that's left many children, young people and families feeling more vulnerable, more isolated, and some and we can see in a number of cases that children and young people with SEND may experience lasting harm as a result of this. And I suppose having been ahead of a specialist setting for children and young people with severe, complex, profound, multiple learning difficulties, I'm just thinking about those children, young people whose physical and health and well-being may have deteriorated in this time, and those whose development and learning in really important areas such as communication, interaction may also have been harmed. But also interestingly, you may have seen that the Disabled Children's Partnership published their back to school survey yesterday, and prior to that, I'm sure you've come across the Left in Lockdown report that they published in June. And it was really important, I think, to recognise in that report what they said about back to school having gone well, better than expected for many disabled children, and families talking about how grateful they are and have been for the effort that schools, teachers, other staff have gone to, and that those children, young people are just glad to be back. But like us, in our briefings and in the commentary that HMCI on the 9th of July, that report also notes that despite the hard work and commitment of education, health and care professionals, things just haven't gone so well for some children, young people with SEND. And in many ways, we can see that the coronavirus pandemic has exposed further some of the cracks in the system that very definitely preceded it. So that's just a bit of very general background and context. I hope that's a useful starting point. I'm gonna work through my slides. I've not got many slides, but as usual, I've probably got too much to say about each of them individually. So I'll try and be brief and make sure we have some time for questions. So on to the Education Inspection Framework, the EIF, and what I'm planning to do for part of this session is give you a slightly technical walkthrough of the behaviour and attitudes judgment area. I hope you'll find this helpful, because I'm often asked, so what do the things that we set out in our handbooks and guidance, what do they actually mean for children and young people who have a special educational need or a disability? What do they mean in the setting that I work in or lead? So I'm hoping that's going to be helpful today. But if you heard me speak about the EIF during the phase that we were developing it, or in the period when we consulted on its content, you remember me saying that we neither want or expect schools to do anything differently for us. And I said at the time, and I'll say it again, that making decisions first and foremost in children and young people's best interests is always the right thing to do in any circumstances, I believe. But to understand any single judgment area in the EIF, I think it's important to understand the main constructs and measures of a high quality education that we set out in the School Inspection Handbook, and to be reminded about its core purpose, what it says right at the beginning of the Education Inspection Framework, so not the handbook, the framework document, and that is that its primary purpose is to support improvement in those we inspect and regulate. And I'm sure you'll have seen, I'm pointing over here because these slides are on my other screen, apologies. I'm sure you'll have seen these quotes from Amanda Spielman before. They're taken from the curriculum commentary that we published 3 versions of in the run-up to the EIF, and I've put them up here today because they summarise the important focus of the EIF on the substance of education, what pupils are taught and how they're taught those things, and the extent to which it helps them to know, remember, and do more. And I'll come back to that because that's our definition of what it means to make progress in the EIF: knowing more, remembering more, being able to do more. And in doing so, and again, we do our best to articulate this clearly in the handbook, in doing those things to achieve great outcomes and be well prepared and ready for the next stage of their lives. And of course, that's particularly important in preparing young people, children, young people who have a special education need or a disability for their lives as young adults and adults. And I always keep in mind that the full preparation for adulthood outcomes in the SEND Code of Practice. I absolutely see the EIF as a force for good in the lives of children and young people with SEND. And I hope you'll recognise that their experience, their progress, their outcomes feature prominently in the EIF, and that's right. But it's also right, isn't it, that this way of understanding the experience of this group of children and young people gives us really deep insights into what is and what isn't working for them right now. So again, I'm sure you've seen this slide before, but it summarises the change in the judgment areas from the Common Inspection Framework to the Education Inspection Framework, the EIF. You'll see the quality of education judgment area right at the top there. So this judgment that brings together curriculum, teaching and assessment as separate but connected parts of the quality of education. And you'll see also on this slide that we've separated what was the personal development, behaviour and welfare judgment into two separate judgments, into the behaviour and attitude judgments, a judgment area which focuses on principally on how leaders create a positive environment in the school and the impact that this has on the behaviour and attitudes of pupils, and the personal development judgment area, which focuses on the school's intent to provide for important aspects of people's personal development, such as becoming responsible, respectful and active citizens, and how well it implements this work. And one of the reasons for separating out those two judgment areas in the EIF was a recognition that, particularly in relation to children and young people's personal development, it's not possible in valid and reliable ways to make a judgment about the impact of the school's work in that area. So in the EIF, in that judgment, our processes for gathering and evaluating evidence focus on the school's intent to support children's learning and development in all of those important qualities and attributes, and how well that intent is translated into practice. And we fully recognise that the impact of many of those things may not be realised in young people's lives, and possibly not until well into adulthood. So I hope that's helpful in drawing a distinction. And I guess the other kind of very pragmatic reason for making that change is that often when we looked at inspection reports for in school inspections that were carried out under the Common Inspection Framework, sometimes the inspection team's findings in those areas were not clearly distinguished. So moving on, and again, this is the last thing I want to say more broadly about the EIF before I focus quite specifically on behaviour and attitudes. But again, it's important to emphasize the connection between each of the judgment areas. And of course, crucial to that is really understanding what the quality of education judgment area is actually all about. So I want to say a few more words about that before I move on. And I also want to highlight a couple of things that we've written in the annual report in relation to that, and the importance of those aspects of behaviour and attitudes and personal development as part of whole curriculum thinking. So why is this connection important? Well, it's important, isn't it, because we know that a high quality curriculum that is well taught and assessed well has an important protective effect for children and young people, such that it stops some children and young people's needs and difficulties from escalating, such that they require something additional or different. So this is about the earliest stage of the graduated approach. What is done well? What makes a difference to children and young people's learning and development? What are the things that prevent the difficulties they experience from escalating? And I hope this is helpful. But in the annual report, we had a couple of very specific things to say about that. In the section on early reading, which is on page 13 of the annual report, we talked about reading being not only the key to the curriculum and essential life skill, but we talked about it being an essential protective factor. Poor reading leads to later low life attainment across subjects and to poor behaviour and self-control. Phonics and early reading are the foundation for success in later life. We also highlighted, and actually I'm not going in order through the report, but on page 9 of the annual report, some of the features of a high quality curriculum, how they link together, and the impact of those things. So there were 4 key things that we identified here. Our analysis shows that the curriculum in outstanding schools tends to be rich. Pupils get a wide range of knowledge and experience. It tends to be well planned and coherent. The school has a top-level approach to curriculum planning, which informs and supports the development of individual subject curriculums. And I'll come on and say a little bit more about that. Well sequenced. The curriculum is planned in such a way that ideas build sequentially over time. In primary, that means that it starts from early reading and phonics and continues through the whole school. In secondary, it means that the Key Stage 3 curriculum provides a solid foundation for GCSE study. And fourthly, comprehensive. Every element of what pupils are taught, including personal development and behaviour, is part of a well-planned curriculum. And that takes me to these boxes really, and what they mean, I suppose, at different levels, when we look at them at different levels. So when we ask people about their understandings of curriculum in the early stage of the research, we got lots of different responses to that. And what we've said is that the curriculum is the what. It's a specific plan of what pupils need to know and should be able to do. So it's something that is detailed and comprehensive. Pedagogy is it's the how, it's how that content is taught, and assessment are the range of tools that we use to gather information about what's being learned and the inferences that we can make from that. So going back to those points in the annual report, sometimes that whole curriculum is as the offer to pupils, everything they experience throughout their time in school. And of course, top-level conversations and inspections are focus on the rationale for the curriculum being as it is. But there are important questions that we ask about the curriculum at that level, especially in relation to children, young people who have a special need or a disability, because it's right, isn't it, that anyone who has experienced any kind of difficulty in their learning and development is likely to need the best curriculum thinking and planning and teaching. But we ask questions about what the curriculum is building towards for individual pupils and for groups of pupils. And we want to know whether achieving the outcomes that leaders have for children and people would be meaningful and aspirational for them. And the extent to which that curriculum is preparing children and people for their next steps. It's giving them the knowledge and the cultural capital they need to be successful in the next phase of their lives. So that's about the whole curriculum offer. But of course, the curriculum as a whole is the sum of its parts, which are typically organised into subjects. And there, what we typically look at is how leaders plan and check that the curriculum in those subjects is carefully planned, that the content is selected and sequenced well. And then, of course, at the level of a sequence of lessons, we look at how successfully children and young people are acquiring and developing their knowledge and understanding through a series of connected inspection activities, and that's what we call our deep dives. And as I've said, I think would always start from a point that content selection and sequencing are crucially important for anyone who experiences any difficulty with knowing and remembering and being able to do more. And of course, there are many dimensions to that, aren't there, for children and young people. The ability to use knowledge fluently and accurately with a high level of automaticity, to be able to use that knowledge in a generalized way to transfer it to different subjects into their everyday lives, and to do all of those things with increasing independence, which are all important measures of learning and development. So let's talk about some of the detail then, and examine some of the links between all of those things and what it means to promote positive behaviour, positive attitudes, and how that contributes to better outcomes. I'm sure you recognise yourselves that in the EIF, it takes an unequivocally strong stance on inclusion. I think as this extract from the leadership and management judgment area illustrates, schools should have an inclusive culture. It should support arrangements to identify early pupils who may be disadvantaged or have additional needs or barriers to learning. And then it goes on to talk about arrangements for meeting those needs and ensuring that pupils have a positive experience of learning and achieve positive outcomes. And I think that, every time I read that, I think about the graduated approach. I think about the assess, plan, do, review cycle, and the importance of that. But I guess it's also important to note and to be reminded that all parts of the EIF apply to state-funded and non-maintained special schools provision for children and young people with SEND, and that there's some important additional guidance in the annexes in the EIF, particularly Part 3, so paragraphs 313 to 317, which sets out things that inspectors will consider when they are gathering and evaluating evidence about the experience of this group of children and young people, and I'm going to come back to a couple of those things. And of course, you'll know if you're very familiar with our handbooks that before inspectors make a final judgment about a school's overall effectiveness, they're required to consider pupils' spiritual, moral, social, and cultural development, and they're required to evaluate the extent to which the school's provision meets the different needs of pupils, including those with SEND. And that's been a feature of every inspection framework. Was one of the recommendations for Ofsted from the Lamb inquiry. So let me talk about this judgment area in a little more detail. So how does this judgment area work? So the focus of the behaviour and attitudes judgment area, I've summarised in the first two bullet points on the slide. It's about how leaders and staff create a safe, calm, orderly and positive environment, and the impact this environment has on the behaviour and attitudes of pupils. And you'll recognise that in the EIF, in every judgment area, there's a bullet point which is very similar to the second one on this slide. The judgment focuses on the factors that research, inspection evidence contribute most strongly to pupils' positive behaviour and attitudes. And I often look at the bullet points it's in paragraph 202 of the section 5 handbook. These factors, what are the things that make the biggest difference? A calm and orderly environment, clear routines and expectations, a strong focus on attendance and punctuality, clear and effective behaviour and attendance policies that are applied consistently and fairly by all staff, pupils' motivation, positive attitudes as important predictors of attainment, the development of positive attitudes, also a strong positive and protective factor, positive culture in the school, and an environment in which pupils feel safe. And in that final bullet point, there's much more detail about what that means. And I'm going to come back and say a little bit towards the end of my slides about the link between behaviour and attitudes and safeguarding. What I thought it might be helpful to do at this point is take a bit of a step out of the EIF and this particular judgment area and just remind you about a really important bit of guidance that we published in 2018. It's called Positive Environments Where Children Can Flourish. It's guidance for inspections of most schools and social care settings. But it's important to I think it's important to look at that guidance because it sets out how we seek to understand how well schools and settings are promoting positive behaviour. And I've summarised 3 points from that guidance, which I hope you recognise as being important yourselves. Foundations of good practice are about building relationships of trust and understanding. We know, don't we, how from a psychological point of view, how important it is for children and people to feel physically, emotionally safe, to be able to build relationships, and how important those things are in creating the right environment within which children can learn and develop well. Understanding triggers, finding solutions, and when incidents do occur, being skilled at diffusing those situations whenever possible. But given the particular focus of today's conference, I didn't want to move through this judgment area without reminding you about some other parts of this guidance, in particular the next paragraph, which is 204 in the School Inspection Handbook, which talks about pupils who have particular needs. And it's an important acknowledgement in the EIF, I think, that some children and people have different starting points in relation to their behaviour and attendance. So what this paragraph explains is that schools may be working with pupils who have particular needs in order to improve their behaviour and attendance, and across a range of different types of settings, mainstream and specialist. That's absolutely essential work for those children, young people, isn't it? You know, it's the work that really turns their lives around. When this is the case, behaviour and conduct reflects the school's high expectations and consistent and fair implementation. But also likely to include demonstrable improvement in the attendance and behaviour of these pupils, taking account of the individual circumstances of the school. So that's about recognising where those starting points are really difficult for those children and people, and giving credit to the work that is being done with them and the impact that it has. Again, you know, in the spirit of trying to be helpful in explaining the guidance, I thought it might be good just to take you through some of the practicalities about how inspectors gather evidence about behaviour and attitudes on an EIF inspection. And I guess the starting point for this is recognising, as always, that inspectors are talking to and listening to leaders and teachers and pupils throughout inspections and throughout the work they do on the quality of education through the deep dive activities. But there are a number of during an inspection. I've highlighted a couple on this slide because I think I do think they're important. And again, for information, the detail of these in the handbook is in paragraphs 209 to 212. But I would really want you to know that when inspectors are selecting a sample of staff to have conversations with, they will include in that sample staff who are affected by pupils' behaviour. They'll want to speak to pupils from different backgrounds and those who have different experiences of the school's approach to behaviour, set out clearly in the guidance. Also, and again, this has been a common feature of this judgment area, whatever form it's taken over at least two frameworks. Inspectors will evaluate the experience of particular individuals and groups. So this is one of the units of inspection that, and I think it reminds us of the importance of remembering that inspection is about understanding what it's like to be a child or young person in that school. But this bullet point provides quite a bit more detail about that. Inspectors will look at a small sample of pupils and consider, in particular, how the school is working with multi-agency groups. There's a very strong link to safeguarding there and the effectiveness of that work. But we say clearly in this part of our guidance that includes, for children and people with SEND, making sure that reasonable adjustments are made in the school's approach in accordance with the requirements of the Equalities Act, but also the SEND regulations and the guidance that's set out in the Code of Practice. And again, I suppose a little more detail about these things, which I hope is also helpful, but just a really practical picture of what inspectors do, all familiar, I'm sure, all set out in paragraph 213 of the school inspection handbook, activities that you will be familiar with. The one that I'd really draw your attention to, the final one. And the three particular things that that inspectors will focus on when looking at this type of provision: safeguarding procedures, the quality of education that's been provided in that type of specialist provision, and how effectively the unit, the resource, is helping pupils to improve their behaviour. So given that this is a facility that is set up principally to improve children and young people's behaviour and attitudes, how successful is that in achieving its I was going to talk about this a little bit earlier. I was going to refer to it a little bit earlier, but now feels like a good time to just remind you that in the EIF there is these separate sections of guidance in Part 3, which separate sets of guidance which explain our approach to considering the experiences of children and people with SEND, those attending pupil referral units, alternative provision, and there's some section on early mathematics, post 16, and early reading as well. And before I wrap up today, I've just got one more slide after this, and then hopefully there's some time for questions. Before I wrap up, I just want to say a little bit about this first, and then talk, just try and bring it all together with some links to the other judgment areas. I'm not going to read through these, I'm sure you're familiar with them already. What I would say though is that I hope you can recognise the person-centred thread that runs through these parts of the guidance, because as I said at the beginning, it's really asking some fundamentally important questions about what is this actually building towards for children and young people with SEND? Are the outcomes they're achieving meaningful and aspirational? And most importantly, as I said earlier, is this helping them to be well prepared for their next steps? Are they well prepared for their next steps in learning, and for young adults in terms of preparing for further education or employment, for living as independently as possible, for being as healthy as possible, and for being as visible and included and active in the communities where they live and work. The last slide, and then I'll pause for breath and hopefully pause for questions as well. It's just going back to where I started really, which is highlighting some really important links and connections between the different judgment areas in the EIF. A few pointers. I think the first of those illustrates the close connection between the behaviour and attitudes judgment and the personal development judgment areas. And as I've said, the importance of understanding that personal development judgment focuses on intent and implementation, what the school is doing to equip pupils with the qualities and attributes they need to be successful in the future. And if you're familiar with that part of the EIF, you'll know that the contribution of things like careers, education and guidance features really significantly. Excuse me. The second one, when I read that, I think for me illustrates the importance of social justice in the EIF. So the extent to which leaders are ambitious for all pupils, including those who are harder to reach, and of course go all the way back to the quality of education judgment area. First bullet point in there, paragraph 169, talks about the inspectors taking a rounded view when they're looking at the quality of education, taking a rounded view of what that's like for all pupils. I put the third bullet point in there as a reminder. You know that our guidance explains how we look at off-rolling, paragraphs 257 to 261, and you'll know how concerned we are about this practice. And lastly, I think it would be wrong to disconnect our approach to looking at children and people's behaviour and attitudes, their personal development, all of the other things that I've talked about, without making some reference to safeguarding and the importance of promoting positive behaviour and creating a culture within which the things that make children and young people vulnerable are identified and acted upon, because you and your colleagues are knowledgeable and vigilant about those things. As I've already said in relation to behaviour, that where a child or young person needs help or support, that it's provided, and it's provided in a timely and effective way, and where that relies on professionals working together in multidisciplinary teams, that multidisciplinary work is effective. And lastly, that whatever those arrangements are, that those with responsibility for safeguarding, leaders and governors, have a really sharp overview of how effective arrangements are. And again, you'll hear in what I'm saying that the different elements of that, we call it identify, help, and manage, and it's set out in the leadership and management judgment area. I'm going to pause there. I'm going to pause there for a moment, because I think I'm hoping that we have got a few minutes for some questions or anything that anyone would like to say. Apologies, I've almost certainly said more there than I'd planned to at the beginning when I was preparing for today. I think I have a bit of a problem with that, as you can probably tell. But I hope some of what I've said has been useful. I think in some ways it feels quite strange talking about the EIF to a group of colleagues at a time when routine inspections are paused. You'll know that we've made some announcements today about our plans for restarting inspections, and I'd encourage you to read them if you haven't already. But lastly, if I can encourage you, please, to look out for a thematic report that we're planning to publish later in December. This is a report that focuses specifically on the experience of children and young people with SEND during the coronavirus pandemic, and it draws from what we've learned from visits to schools and settings in all of our different remits across Ofsted and with our colleagues and CQC, and in doing so aims to give voice to those things and to the work that leaders and practitioners have done in order to support improvement on their behalf. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen. I'm going to stop sharing my screen at that point and pause and check out if there are any questions or comments that anyone would like to make.
Thanks, Nick. That was great. Does anyone want to come off mute and ask any questions? Okay, Mark, could you just unmute yourself? There we go.
Hello there.
Hi Mark, good to see you.
Good afternoon, Nick and everyone else. I must admit, I haven't caught up with Ofsted's news today. I no doubt will like to, and I think I've got Jenna and other people asking a few questions, Nick, about what is happening, because we've been so busy in this programme today, we haven't caught up with the news.
What I'll tell you is that we posted our update plans for a phased return to inspections on .gov this morning, and I believe the Secretary of State has made some announcements. Talks about from January resuming monitoring inspections of schools judged to be inadequate at their previous inspection. Some schools graded as RI. Those inspections won't result in a grade. Emergency inspections of schools will continue as if they've done so throughout the pandemic in response to any serious concerns. Routine inspections which result in a school being awarded a new grade or being confirmed in its current grade, will resume in the summer term. Okay. That's the announcement. And if you look through that, and I'm conscious that there'll be colleagues from different phases and independent and maintained schools, there's further guidance there about the overall approach, the rationale for that, propose arrangements for plans for independent schools, further education skills, early years, children's social care, and a little bit about the area send interim visits, and our plan to resume those visits. There's plan to resume those visits in the spring.
Right. Right, thanks very much for that. That gives us a bit of reassurance, I think, that actually it's proportionate to where there's most risk already identified in the system by the sound of it, so that's good.
Well, thanks for that, Mark.
One of the things I'm sure we're all interested in is how will inspectors take into account the vulnerable people's experience of isolation through COVID and lockdown, because from what I'm gathering, there are concerns from parent groups in particular, saying that some young people haven't had any real contact from schools. How is that going to be sort of evaluated, and possibly where? I mean, I know it's going to be work between now and possibly when inspections properly resume, but clearly that's an area that is of concern.
Yeah, of course. And like I said, as I was working through the slides, Mark, I guess like you and others, I looked at the Disabled Children's Partnerships Back to School report last night. I read the summary, I looked at the data, I looked at the section about, from the 3,400 responses they had to the survey, the 24% of children, young people who hadn't returned to education. You're spot on. Those are things that we're thinking about and working on and going to continue to work on in the coming weeks and months. I think I might have said when I came to the NAHT Send Council that in area send, what we want to do in the interim visits we're going to do in the spring term is get a deeper understanding of that. Because I think I said to you at the time that what we need to understand is what are the factors here? What are the things that are helping children, young people return successfully to education? What are the things that are getting in the way of that successful return to education? Because we can see that some things, such as regular high quality communication between children, young people and families during the period of the pandemic over the summer had a really positive impact. We can see that where pre-existing relationships between families, professionals and between professionals were strong, that had also been a protective factor and supported some children, young people in returning to education. We can see that there've been, for some children, young people, have been huge barriers with specialist services that were provided prior to the pandemic, either stopping or being provided in a form which is and isn't working. And I guess it won't surprise you, Mark, to know that in the forefront of my mind are those the children and people with the most significant and complex these needs, those for whom I really find it hard to understand how it would be possible to replicate the highly specialised environment that you and colleagues create in your schools, with the skilled adults who you have to support their learning and development away from that school and in the home. And it feels to me like we've actually got to really face into that and recognise that for those children, young people, that is an absolutely essential starting point to their learning and development. And if that cannot be substituted for, then their learning and development is going to slip collectively through our fingers.
Sorry, I'm not going to try and hog this, but one of the things I feel all settings will benefit from is a little bit further advice about how potentially to do these case studies that we might want to present back to inspectors of the successful interventions we put in place, and maybe and also learn from things that haven't worked so well, because learning is failure as well as success. So again, if that can be shared at some point, that would be great.
I'll take that away, Mark, as as a question for colleagues. I really appreciate that. I think just two things really briefly, because I don't want to and to give other people a bit of a chance to ask a question as well.
Right,
And one is that I think that the feedback that we've had from the schools interim visits has generally been very positive. I think people have valued the time that they've had to think about and talk about and reflect on what has and hasn't worked. I think in the visits that we've been doing to local areas, I think the case study approach has been particularly insightful. So looking at the experience of a relatively small number of children and people, but doing that deeply with all of the professionals who work closely with them, and practically having a 90-minute conversation with a group of 12 or 15 people who know that child and family really well, really chewing over what has and hasn't worked for them, what some of the learning going forward has been. Those feel like really important ways of working to me. But I will absolutely take that away, Mark, and ask that question and come back to you.
Right, thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Does anyone else have any questions that they'd like to unmute? No, no one else wants to unmute.
I'm sorry, can I just ask a quick question about inspectors generally of interest? How much kind of thinking about the complex nature of some children and school environments, how much kind of experience do inspectors actually have across the inspectorate in terms of knowledge of that? Obviously you do, because you talked about it earlier, but it kind of concerns me slightly, especially in the primary school where I've got nearly 20% EHCPs compared to the national average of 3% that I was looking at earlier. I often wonder whether those inspectors coming into schools like mine have that experience to be able to make those judgments on what they see.
Yeah, thanks. Really good question. Two things I'd say, Barry, if this is helpful. I think for me, I absolutely recognise that we can help our colleagues. I can help my colleagues to develop their specialist knowledge, skills, understanding, knowledge of how to apply the EIF to children and young people who have different starting points. I can help with the quality assurance of inspections, with either on site or by looking at evidence bases, with reports, all of those kinds of things. But what I can't substitute for is the specialist experience and knowledge that my colleagues bring from their backgrounds. It would be wrong to think that would be the case, wouldn't it? So what I would say is that we work really hard on their professional development, helping those people to apply the instruments that we have, the tools that we have, particularly in the EIF in different types of settings. I would have to say to you that, from my time as a head as well as my time as a HMI, that I believe the way that we approach this in the EIF is a positive step and a way of thinking about what it means to provide a high quality education that applies to all children and people, irrespective of their starting points. But the last thing I'd say is that remember that, and this has happened in the time that I've been an HMI, so from about 2015 onwards, that in recent history, Ofsted had a contracted, had 3 inspection contractors who provided inspectors for schools inspections and for early years inspections of early years settings. But now we have our own team of Ofsted inspectors who are contracted directly to us, and the majority of those are serving practitioners, are head teachers and senior leaders. And I would struggle to remember a time in the last 3 or 4 years when I've been leading an inspection or working with another team, there haven't been several serving practitioners part of those teams, often colleagues who have a similar kind of specialist background to me.
Thank you for that. I'm just conscious that we're running out of time. We've got a few minutes left and we have got a few questions come into the chat, so I'll just read a couple of those out for you. So one of them is access to external services is having a significant impact. The waiting lists are long. Is this taken into consideration?
So we're finding out a lot about that through our schools visits, through our area STEM visits, and as Mark was saying, you know, we're at a stage where we are still gathering evidence about what it's been like for children and young people in this period, in particular, what the return to education has been like. And we're just at the beginning, having made those announcements today, of developing the detail of what the return to inspection will look like. But I've heard your point loudly and clearly, and it aligns with what we're seeing and what we're writing about.
Great. If anyone else wants to unmute, please do so. I'll just read one of the other ones from the chat. How can schools fully showcase the outcomes of our students with SEND when progress can appear limited?
So I think that's about. I think it's about the nature of the methodology for an EIF inspection, because the top level conversation is about several things. So from the initial call through to initial meetings on site is all about what are my expectations and ambitions for this group of children and young people? Where do they come from? How have we arrived at those things? And what are we doing to give children and young people the best chance of achieving those? What's our broad intentions, but what are our specific plans in our curriculum? You know, how have we made decisions about what we're going to teach, how we're going to teach it, and what does our evidence of those outcomes over time indicate about how successful we are? So that's about looking at the whole curriculum. But of course, in an EIF inspection, we look at children and people's experience through a sequence of lessons and work out how to connect back what we've learned through those activities back to those bigger steps in learning that we know children and young people make over longer periods of time. So it's really why that question of what is this all building towards? Can I see that what this child or young person is learning right now is helping them towards these bigger steps that they need to make in their learning and development over a longer period of time? Because I guess, like many of you, I would always start from the point of view that if you find learning difficult for whatever reason, that the decisions that people make about what they're going to teach and how they're going to teach it are even more important. But it's really the mechanism for looking at that is the quality of education methodology. And if you're not familiar with it and you want to read a little bit more about that, I would have a look at the Inspecting the Curriculum document that we published in, I think it was May 2019. It sets it out in much more detail.
That's lovely. Thank you very much. I'm afraid we've run out of time. So all that's left for me to say to everyone is thank you very much for joining us. Do take a break now, and the next session will be at 3 o'clock. And thank you very much, Nick. That was a really interesting session.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you. Take care.
And you, everyone. Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.